Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. I'm Xiao, and I'm presenting our research on loot boxes. My main focus is to highlight that players potentially engage with loot boxes very differently in different countries and cultures. It is important that this is recognized because many different countries are considering regulating loot boxes, but the regulatory solution in different countries could reasonably be very different because of these differences. Many of you might be familiar with the concept of loot boxes, but I'll start by setting out how we define loot boxes for our studies. Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of varying in-game and real-world value. They can take on many different virtual forms, such as treasure chests, car packs, prize wheels, or gacha character summoning systems. Many games contain these mechanics, including, for example, Genshin Impact. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that require money to buy. These are seemingly more harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real-world money by players. Some games allow for player trading, enabling loot box rewards to be transferred between players. These systems may enable players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. What can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are just cosmetic. For example, they might make your sword glow green instead of red, or give you gold rather than silver armor without any increase in power. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. For example, they could unlock additional content or give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons that can defeat enemies more easily. This means that players who paid for loot boxes can potentially become stronger than other players, thus potentially encouraging those other players to also buy loot boxes so that they can compete on a more equal footing. Some extreme cases of individual players' loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending more than the equivalent of 1,000 Canadian dollars in just 1 month. Another player spent over the equivalent of 13,000 Canadian dollars in just 2 years on one single game. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent around the equivalent of 900 Canadian dollars of their father's money on loot boxes without permission and still didn't get the rare item that they were after. And so what are the potential harms of loot boxes? Firstly, they're structurally similar to gambling. Both loot boxes and traditional gambling involve the player or gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining something more valuable or more money through a randomized process. Empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe that a participant's problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. Although I will add that we don't know yet whether loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are simply more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. However, it appears that video game companies are disproportionately profiting from players with problem gambling issues. Regulators around the world are therefore considering whether or not to regulate loot boxes because of their potential harms and because of how easily children can have access to them. This is why the regulation of loot boxes is a global consumer protection challenge. However, the existing literature has focused only on Western samples and the experience of players from Western countries. For example, yes, the correlation between loot box purchasing and problem gambling severity mentioned earlier has been consistently replicated in 16 different studies. However, those replications took place using only Western samples. We know from prior cross-cultural studies of multiple Western countries that the strength of this relationship is weaker in some countries than in other countries. This relationship could be weaker or stronger in non-Western countries, or the relationship might not even exist because of inherent differences. For example, we know that national video game markets in various countries can be structurally very different. Our previous research on the prevalence of loot boxes in China found that 91% of the highest grossing iPhone games contain loot boxes. Compare that with how only 59% of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games were found to contain loot boxes in the UK in 2019. We also found that 19.5% of games deemed suitable for children aged 12 plus in China contained loot boxes, compared to 58.9% in the UK. In addition to structural differences in the video game markets, how gambling is regulated is also very different across countries and cultures. The only form of legal gambling in China is the lotteries, Whilst in Western countries, the legalization of gambling has led to a proliferation of different types of legal gambling, from sports betting to slot machines, from casino games to easily accessible gambling apps on mobile phones. This means that Chinese video game players have significantly less access to legalized gambling than video game players in Western countries do. Additionally, China and the West also differs in terms of loot box regulation. In China, some degree of consumer protection is provided in relation to loot boxes by the Ministry of Culture's legal requirement for game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized rewards. In contrast, loot boxes are generally unregulated in the West, although I note that one specific country, Belgium, has imposed loot box regulation. This means that players in China may be making more informed loot box purchasing decisions than players in Western countries because they are aware of how likely or unlikely they are to obtain the rewards that they want and how much on average it will cost them to do so. Given so many differences between China and Western countries, it must be asked whether the same relationship between loot box purchasing and problem gambling will replicate in non-Western countries such as China. Our study was a cross-sectional survey that participants self-selected into participating, so the usual disclaimers apply. We advertised on online video gaming forums and received 879 effective responses. Participants were predominantly young male students. This is not surprising, given that similar previous studies in Western countries using similar methodologies also recruited nearly 90% male participants. Quite importantly, only a small minority of our sample, about 10%, self-reported gambling participation in the previous 12 months. This should be contrasted with how internationally 40 to 60% of participants would tend to report gambling participation. We pre-registered 3 hypotheses. Firstly, we hypothesized a positive correlation between loot box spending and problem gambling severity, which would replicate the previous Western findings. However, due to the low gambling participation rate, we were unable to find a statistically significant result. Secondly, we hypothesized a positive correlation between loot box spending and past year gambling participation. We did find a positive correlation. However, it was very weak. Similarly, thirdly, we hypothesized a positive correlation between loot box spending and impulsiveness, and our results were again that there was only a very weak positive correlation. The conclusions that could be drawn from our results are that there appear to be weaker relationships between gambling and loot boxes in China than in Western countries. It is possible that loot box spending is only correlated with some types of gambling. For example, use of slot machines or use of gambling apps on mobile phones. And that it is possible that loot box spending is not correlated with other forms of gambling, such as the traditional lottery that is available in China. The unavailability of more modern and gamified types of gambling might explain the potential absence or the very weak nature of these correlations in China. Why was it necessary to find out whether this relationship will replicate? This is because this relationship has been relied upon by policymakers and regulators to justify needing to regulate loot boxes. If this relationship does not exist in a country, the argument for regulating the mechanic in that country becomes much weaker. We know that both developed and developing countries across the world are considering regulating loot boxes. It would be inappropriate for the Western literature to be assumed to be applicable to players in, for example, Brazil, without further research. It would be wrong also to impose restrictions on individual freedom on the basis of research that will not necessarily be replicable to the population that the restrictions are intended to apply to. Our research in China only represents a first step to better understanding this issue. Other countries should consider conducting similar research to inform evidence-guided regulation. Indeed, people from different cultures within the same country might experience loot boxes differently. More nuanced research as to the relationship between gambling and loot boxes is required. Now, turning to the question of how loot boxes should be regulated, there are several potential ways to do this, and restricting players from purchasing loot boxes, in other words, an outright ban, as adopted in Belgium, is only one of many different potential approaches. Another less restrictive approach that retains players' autonomy to purchase loot boxes and preserve video game companies' existing commercial interests is to require loot box probability disclosures. This has been required by law in China. What does loot box probability disclosures mean in practice? Here are 2 examples of probability disclosures taken from video game screenshots. On the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 4.61% chance of obtaining an elite tier hero, the rarest category of reward available. On the right, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items. For example, a player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario in his happy outfit. So why are probability disclosures potentially helpful? Well, they mean that players have a better idea of how many loot boxes they might need to buy before they decide to spend their money. And it also illustrates just how low their chances are of getting some of the rarest rewards that they were looking forward to obtaining. This might discourage players from spending too much money on loot boxes. As I mentioned, China is currently the only country to require loot box probability disclosures by law. Worldwide, however, video game companies have adopted this measure as a form of industry self-regulation. For example, Apple and Google require probability disclosures for all games on their respective app stores. The law generally has greater enforcement power in the sense that non-compliant companies could be fined. In contrast, industry self-regulation is generally voluntary, and non-compliant companies face no negative consequences. This raises the question, is legal regulation more effective than industry self-regulation? If industry self-regulation is just as effective, then there is no need for other countries to introduce laws such as the one adopted in China. But if industry self-regulation is less effective, then other countries should also consider adopting this measure as a law to improve the compliance rate in the interests of consumer protection. Previously, we assessed the loot box probability disclosure rate of the 100 highest grossing iPhone games in mainland China in 2020. We found that 95.6% of games containing loot boxes disclose probabilities. However, the disclosure rate that we found in the UK when we examined a comparable sample was only 64%. This was significantly lower than the Chinese compliance rate. This means that at least in the loot box probability disclosure context, voluntary self-regulation is less effective than the law at ensuring compliance. In countries where industry self-regulation has already been adopted, such as Canada, probability disclosures should still be required by law to increase the compliance rate and actually provide the level of consumer protection that is being promised to video game players. This, however, doesn't mean that industry self-regulation is completely useless. In fact, there are many potential benefits. An industry regulator is much better able to understand technical aspects of video game design and respond more quickly and more cost-effectively to new industry developments and to any instances of non-compliance, whereas the law is often incredibly slow in adapting to novel issues. What the industry self-regulation we've looked at so far is missing is enforcement powers. Apple and Google don't appear to punish companies for breaking their self-regulations by not making probability disclosures, but it's possible for industry self-regulation to get stricter. Through contractual terms, self-regulators such as app stores could impose and enforce private law punishments. App stores can delist non-compliant companies, disable in-app purchase features, and even freeze funds and delay the transfer of revenue generated by the game's previous month's sales. In the face of such threats, video game companies will be far more likely to do what they originally promised to do and actually disclose probabilities to their players. We can look at the example of South Korea's industry self-regulation. This has better enforcement powers than the Apple and Google app stores, as companies face some consequences for breaking it. And this self-regulation reported a compliance rate of 90.8% in August 2021, much higher than the 64% found in the UK and closer to the 95.6% found under Chinese law. Players in different countries potentially engage with loot boxes in very different ways, and future research should consider those differences in order to guide evidence-informed regulation. Indeed, different countries have already taken different approaches to loot box regulation. For example, most countries have not really done anything, but China has required probability disclosures and Belgium has effectively banned all loot boxes from their market. These differences in national regulatory approaches represent opportunities to study the effectiveness of each of these measures at reducing the harms of loot boxes. Rather than being preoccupied with only samples of Western video game players, we should consider the perspectives of different countries in order to guide regulatory developments across the world. Thank you very much for tuning into this presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions during the Q&A session, and please do get in touch with us using any of these methods if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.